Welcome back everyone to Formula 1 Transfer Talk. Now, last episode we spoke about the future of Sebastian Vettel and Ferrari. I've often looked at midfield teams in the weekly mailbox, and the Red Bull Junior programme and the Red Bull family is always talked about on this channel. But I think something I've always not necessarily avoided, but never really put into words or a particular video, is Mercedes. And we all know they've got a very solid lineup at the moment of Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas. But how is that going to evolve over the next few years? It's a topic that a lot of people discuss, and a lot of people have sent in questions in the weekly mailbox wanting me to talk about this subject. But I thought what I could do today is, and if you're new, this isn't usually how we do things, but we're changing it up a little bit. I'm going to go off script. No scripting today, pure opinion based. So this could get a little bit too spicy to handle. Going to talk about what I think is going to happen to Mercedes over the next few years and the potential different roads they could go down. Taking a look at a little bit of future of Lewis Hamilton, of Bottas, and then the likes of Russell, Ocon, other drivers from maybe outside of the Mercedes family. So if you're new around here, feel free to subscribe. I hope you enjoy today's, again, slightly different variation of Transfer Talk. But I think best place to start is when Mercedes returned in 2010. They brought back Michael Schumacher from a 4-year absence of Formula 1. The 7-time world champion partnered with youngster Nico Rosberg, who'd spent a couple of years at Williams and had scored podiums and was proving himself to be one of the better youngsters on the Formula 1 grid. So a really strong lineup. They spent 3 seasons together. Rosberg claiming his first ever Formula 1 victory in China, also got a second place in Monaco that season, and Schumacher got his one and only podium in his return in Valencia. A strong lineup, no doubt, but when Schumacher moved on at the end of 2012, in came Lewis Hamilton. A fierce rivalry, as I'm sure most of you are aware, erupted over the next few seasons, especially in the hybrid era where Rosberg and Hamilton really bucked horns. In 2013, their first season, it was actually Rosberg who claimed 2 victories, Hamilton just the 1. 2014, however, Hamilton was world champion again in 15. Rosberg, 2016, claimed his first and only world title. Driver lineup still proved to be insane, but at the end of that season, Rosberg retired. Mercedes, of course, had plenty of options, the likes of Ricciardo, Verstappen, Vettel. Who else at the time did we have? I guess Kvyat was in a top team at the time. But the bottom line was, every driver wanted to be in that Mercedes seat. But they eventually went with Valtteri Bottas, a driver who had proved himself well at Williams, who again, like Rosberg all the way back in 2010, had scored podiums for Williams. And Mercedes decided he was the right man for the job. He was also, at the time, this is Valtteri, was under management of Toto Wolff. So the stars aligned for Valtteri. He got his dream move to Mercedes, and only 4 or 5 rounds into the season, got his first ever victory in Sochi. And he's remained there ever since, alongside Lewis Hamilton. So since they returned in 2010, the team has only had 4 drivers: Rosberg, Schumacher, Hamilton and Bottas. So we're now, obviously, in 2020, if you haven't noticed. I know dates and days kind of out of the window at the moment. But looking forward, is it sensible for them to continue this philosophy? 4 drivers in 10 years is very bizarre for a Formula 1 team, even for the likes of Ferrari, that are synonymous with being very cautious with their lineups. But there's no denying this consistent philosophy and understanding between the teams and drivers, I would argue, is one of the key reasons why Mercedes has been so prevalent at the front of the grid since the hybrid era, since 2014. And I think, although a lot of people believe that Bottas isn't quite the level of a Formula 1 champion, I certainly believe that if all the luck went his way and if he potentially got number 1 treatment more often, then he could be within a chance. But it makes total sense for the team right now to have a number 1, Lewis Hamilton, and a strong number 2 in Bottas, who has proved over his 3 years at Mercedes that he can do the job on his day, but also he is more than happy to be a team player. And that's kind of where I was trying to go with the Ferrari video, talking about Sebastian Vettel. If Vettel is happy moulding into that role, makes sense to keep him. But if it's not, maybe Ferrari should look elsewhere, because Mercedes, their model at the moment works so well. So looking forward now, because that's kind of what I want to do in these transfer talk videos, would it be sensible for Mercedes to shake it up a hell of a lot? You'd argue not, but there's quite a few different factors that go into the Mercedes broth. Hamilton, we'll start there, because this is probably what most people want to have a little discussion about. And as always with Transfer Talk, I'm just going to talk a load of nonsense, but the real conversation will be in the comments, so I will join you there after this is finished. But Lewis Hamilton has been in Formula 1 since 2007 and is the second oldest driver now on the grid. He might have been last year, not quite sure how old Robert Kubica is, but Raikkonen's the oldest, then it's Lewis Hamilton, which is always a statistic that catches me off guard a little bit. But I think it's still a plausible argument to say he's in his prime, or at least coming to the end of his prime. And I think any Formula 1 team would love to have Lewis Hamilton in their car, and I think Hamilton's ability would happily see him through to his 40s, mid-40s. I really do believe that. Hamilton himself, though, I think is where the big factor comes in here. He loves his music. He loves his fashion. He loves being creative in other areas away from Formula 1. And I've kind of thought about this a little bit as well with the current situation. This is giving drivers like Hamilton, and Raikkonen as well, the opportunity to see what retirement would kind of be like. I know, obviously, this is very much unprecedented times, but it might give them the chance to think, yes, this is what life kind of would be like without racing. And I hope for the likes of Raikkonen and Hamilton, it gives them a little bit more energy, a little bit more oomph to go on a couple more years. And whereas Raikkonen, I'm pretty confident we will probably see him retire at the end of this season or the next one, Hamilton is much harder to read. He's obviously got one eye on the records, and although he says he doesn't, I've got a little feeling he's got one eye at least looking at those records, wanting to have the most championships of any driver. So if Mercedes give him a car to do that over the next few years, why go now? Why not wait? So I think for now, I don't see Hamilton going for another 3 or 4 years, but very easily could be one of those drivers that I think could just spring a surprise on the grid, like Rosberg did in 2016, and say, look guys, I'm retiring. But I certainly think he will get to, or at least try to get to 7 titles before that happens. So then you turn your attentions to Bottas. If Hamilton stays, is Bottas the right man? And again, looking at it on paper, they are such an awesome duo together. Yes, they're not 1-2 every weekend like Hamilton and Rosberg were, but it's a different dynamic. That was very much a fluid number 1 and number 1 relationship. This is much more a structured Hamilton's number 1, Bottas is number 2. And Formula 1 just this morning put out a video about the most sportsman-like moments in Formula 1. I think the title was something like that. And there were some incredible ones later on in the list. But even little things like Hungary 2017, Hamilton and Bottas' first season together, letting each other through, giving each other chances, not being cheeky like the Hamilton and Rosberg one. And those little cheeky moments really did end up exploding into their, like I said earlier, very toxic relationship we saw at the end of their time together. Bottas has had some down moments on track. He has had some moments where he's had to let Hamilton through to let him fight for the title, and I'm sure that wound him up. But as a whole, their relationship between teammates, I would argue, is one of the better ones on the grid. I would definitely put it in maybe the top 2 or 3 relationships between drivers. And considering they're quite closed-off characters, Hamilton and Bottas, I think that's quite nice for the team. So, does it make sense then, with a big regulation change coming up in 2022, to move Bottas on and bring in a new driver? Russell would be the most obvious driver, you would say. And I'll talk about him a little bit now, because if you're not aware, George Russell, who drives for Williams, is a Mercedes junior driver. Means Mercedes have helped him out and sponsored him through his GP3 career, Formula 2 career, and now Formula 1. Russell still carries the Mercedes badge on his helmet. Still does testing for Mercedes. Did it last year at the end of the season and the mid-season test George Russell did for Mercedes. So got very close links with that team, and many would argue if Hamilton retired, if Bottas moved on, Russell would be the guy they brought in next. And I think that's the right decision. Russell has now had just 1 year in Formula One, like Leclerc had at Alfa Romeo before he moved to Ferrari. And whilst Russell is set to drive at Williams again this year, he could be one of those drivers that deserves driver of the season in our kind of fan world, but we will never know if Williams are at the back of the field again. And I think for George Russell, if Hamilton gets a 5-year deal with Mercedes, which I'm sure they'll try and aim for me that suggests a perfect opportunity to bring in George Russell. They can perhaps keep Bottas for another season, bring in Russell maybe for the big regulation change in 2022. That would nicely line up with another 1-year extension for Valtteri. Give him one final chance to win a title. That's going to be, 5 seasons then at Mercedes for him? A nice run. I think that's definitely enough time to have been able to establish himself and put himself in the shop window for other teams. And for George Russell, that would end his 3-year deal nicely with Williams and would still mean Hamilton's got 3 years alongside Russell. So then George can learn off Lewis, which is a brilliant opportunity. And I often say that's, I believe, why Giovinazzi has got much, much better over his 1 season in Formula One, learning alongside Kimi Räikkönen. And I think for Russell, having that benchmark of Hamilton will really be able to push him on, but also from a fan perspective, from our perspective, I think it will give us a much better idea of how good George Russell is. And there is potential. It could go back to what it was like with Hamilton and Rosberg if Russell is on the level that so many, including me, think he has the potential to be. But I think while you've got a driver like Hamilton in the team, it would be silly for Hamilton to leave. I mean, obviously, that's not really in the team's control, but if Hamilton is there at the team, it would be silly to waste that knowledge, that expertise that Russell could learn off of. For Valtteri, that would be savage, because again, he has been such an incredible servant to that team. But again, if Hamilton moves on, I think logically, whilst the team would love to bring in a Verstappen and instantly just replace Hamilton with another straight-up number 1 driver, financially it makes sense to bring in Russell. And also, again, if you bring in a Verstappen, Russell is going to struggle to establish himself within Mercedes if Bottas moves on. So if Hamilton stays, I think for 2022, you bring in Russell. That, for me, is the ideal scenario for Mercedes. If Hamilton goes, I still think you bring in George Russell. I still think you try and wiggle him out of that Mercedes or Williams deal that they have together and put him alongside Bottas. And if it doesn't work out, you can move on Bottas if needs be. You can bring in a Ricciardo from the midfield, a Sainz, a Norris from the midfield, something like that. But I certainly think if either of them move on, George Russell will come in. And I can already sense some of you screaming, saying, Dan, no, you're missing so many drivers. So I'll kind of round off this video. I spoke about Russell, Hamilton and Bottas, but there's certainly drivers that have an outside chance of getting in Mercedes if they play their cards right, and if things, like I say, if Hamilton leaves suddenly and they don't want to keep Bottas, maybe a few of these drivers could sneak in. I'll start with Esteban Ocon, because this is a driver that was part of the Mercedes Junior program for such a long time, and in 2020 has finally got himself back onto the Formula One grid in the shoes of a Renault driver alongside Daniel Ricciardo. What this has meant is that he is no longer part of the Mercedes Junior program. However, he is still under management of Mercedes. What's the difference? Not a lot. It's the official answer, but it means that Toto Wolff, a little bit like Wolff did with Bottas when just before he moved to Mercedes, Toto Wolff is still Esteban Ocon's manager. So there's still definitely a link there, and I would still put Ocon pretty close to a Mercedes drive if Russell is deemed not ready. If Latifi beats Russell in 2020, then maybe Ocon, if he can beat Ricciardo, certainly puts himself more in the driving seat. But again, not being part of that Mercedes Junior program anymore, having that 2-year deal with Renault, again, to me suggests that 2022 is going to be when Mercedes chain up their lineup. They're going to have clear options with both Russell and Ocon ending their contracts with their current teams. Bottas, again, if he gets a one-year deal, just matches up so nicely, so perfectly. And it's pretty much going to be a straight scrap between Ocon and Russell. But again, for me, of what I've seen of the pair of them, I think Russell has the edge. But that is the only, in my opinion, other realistic driver who could get in that Mercedes seat is Esteban Ocon, if he can comfortably beat Ricciardo for 2 years and maybe snatch a podium and dominate that midfield. Is he ready for the challenge? I'm not sure. I've not seen enough of Ocon yet, I would say, to be able to prove, or for me to say definitively, yes, he is good enough to do that. People are still going to scream if I don't mention Vettel, I don't mention Ricciardo, don't mention Verstappen. If Hamilton leaves, if Bottas leaves, and it's a complete free-for-all for Mercedes, which again could be an option. They both run out of contract at the end of this year. Hamilton might decide he doesn't want to stay. Bottas, well, the team might decide they don't want to renew him. They could bring in Russell and a Sebastian Vettel. I spoke about it in our talk about Seb, in our last transfer talk. This only works if Seb is ready to be that number 2 driver. If he's ready to accept that Russell is going to try and fight him for that number 1 status. I don't really see it happening. I don't see why Mercedes would want to get rid of Bottas in favour of a Vettel. Although Vettel comes with his titles, and although I think Seb is going to bounce back in 2020, to me, doesn't quite make sense long term. And as we've seen and spoke about at the beginning of this video, a lot of Mercedes decisions are focused on the long term. Verstappen, I said it earlier, if Hamilton goes, yes, it's a quick fix to bring in Max. But Max himself, you've got to think of it from his perspective, is in a brilliant position. He's in the lead Honda team in Formula 1, which a couple of years ago wouldn't have been a great thing to say. But I think Honda have revived their reputation with the Red Bull family. And not only that, Max is clearly the number 1 at Red Bull. And I would argue there's no one really in AlphaTauri. I wouldn't necessarily say Albon. No one particularly in Formula 2, Formula 3 that I think are going to threaten Verstappen for a very long time. So why would Max throw that away to move to Mercedes, to go up against Ocon, which I don't think that would work, or to go up against George Russell in the future? I think that's crazy. If Mercedes, again, made that decision, because that's encouraging the Rosberg-Hamilton relationship. But from a Max Verstappen point of view, yes, it would be great to see him in the number 1 car. Yes, if he was in the best car, he would probably win the title. But it just is silly, in my opinion, to have him move from Red Bull. From Verstappen's point of view, Ricciardo, I would put as the only other realistic option if Russell and Ocon were off the table. I say this because Ricciardo is a proven race winner. He's a driver that isn't going to cause upsets, sillinesses within a team. He's there to get the job done, but he's also there to have a good time. We saw his relationship with Verstappen, although they made contact, although it soured on occasion, very quickly that relationship was tight-knitted almost the next weekend or a couple of weekends later. And that positive energy, I've always said, that's kind of why I rate Ricciardo so highly, because he does his talking on the track. He's a flashy driver, but not a dirty driver. And for a team like Mercedes, if they're going through a big transition, again, if Hamilton and Bottas do move on, a driver like Ricciardo, I think, is going to offer you a really stable option. And Ricciardo himself's not in the best situation at the moment at Renault, and I think would be a driver ready to move to another top team like he was at Red Bull, and certainly would be a driver that maybe is past his best a little bit, but I certainly would believe would be able to fight for a title, but also would be happy alongside a Russell, alongside an Ocon, a Bottas, whoever, even Hamilton, if they deem Ocon and Russell not ready. Even Hamilton for a couple of years, I think Ricciardo could be a really sensible option if Russell and Ocon aren't ready. And I think I'll leave that there. Yeah, I've definitely spoke for longer than I would have expected, but hey, it's a topic that's been on my mind for quite some time, and I'm sure it's one in the comment section below you'll have your own thoughts on, so I will try my best over the next couple of weeks to jump back down. I did with the Vettel video last time, and I'll do it again because it's always fun seeing you all suggest that Raghunathan and Maldonado should be there in 2022. So yeah, I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments below. I would love it if you enjoyed the video. Hit that like button. If you didn't, hit that dislike button. Don't do that, but if you did dislike, feel free. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you're all keeping safe. I hope you're all keeping well, and I hope to see you in the next one.